Lunch in the Soviet Union was a serious business, designed to fuel a nation of workers. These were not just meals, they were a part of a massive system. Get ready to explore the plates of the past, because one popular soup on our list was actually a military secret before it ever hit the dinner table. 1. Borscht. First up is the king of all Soviet soups, borscht. You probably know it from its bright, beautiful red color. That amazing color comes from the main ingredient, beets. But here is the thing nobody tells you. Borscht is so much more than just beet soup. It is a hearty mix of shredded cabbage, potatoes, carrots, and onions, all swimming in a savory broth. Sometimes it had meat, like beef, but just as often it was completely meatless to save money. Every family and every cafeteria had its own slightly different recipe. A big dollop of sour cream, called smetana, was almost always added on top right before eating. It made the soup creamy and balanced out the earthy taste of the beets. What many overlooked is that this soup was a nutritional powerhouse. In a time and place where fresh vegetables could be hard to find in the winter, borscht was packed with vitamins from all the root vegetables. It was the ultimate comfort food, warming you up from the inside out on a cold Russian day. It was cheap to make, easy to cook in huge batches, and could feed a whole lot of people. But a warm soup is not always what you want. What if you were feeling a little under the weather? Or just wanted something light? The next soup on our list was the go-to answer, a clear broth that was as simple as it gets. 2. Chicken broth soup. When you just wanted something simple and comforting, chicken broth soup was the answer. You might know it as chicken noodle soup, and the Soviet version was very similar. It was basically a clear, golden chicken broth, often with very little chicken meat in it, but full of thin little noodles called vermicelli. The whole point of this soup was to be light and easy on the stomach. It was the kind of meal your mom or grandma would make for you if you were sick. It was warm, comforting, and easy to get down. In the cafeterias, it was a super common first course before the main meal. The thing that made it so popular was its simplicity. You did not need a lot of fancy or expensive ingredients to make it. A few chicken parts could make a huge pot of broth, and the noodles were very cheap and filling. Sometimes they would add a little bit of chopped carrot or onion for a bit of extra flavor and color. It was not a fancy meal by any means. To put it mildly, it was often pretty plain, but it was reliable. You always knew what you were getting with a bowl of chicken broth soup. It was like a warm hug in a bowl. Now, after a light soup, you needed something more substantial. The next dish is a true icon of Soviet cafeterias, a meat patty that has a surprising secret about what was really inside. 3. Fried meatballs. Now we get to the heart of the Soviet lunch plate. Kotlety, which are basically fried meatballs or meat patties. These were everywhere, from school cafeterias to factory lunch lines to the family dinner table. But here's the kicker, the Soviet kotleta was not always full of meat. You see, meat could be expensive and hard to get. So, to make the ground meat stretch further, a huge amount of filler was added. The biggest secret ingredient was bread. A good chunk of a kotleta was actually stale bread that had been soaked in milk or water and mixed in with the minced meat, along with onions and spices. This made them soft and also made a small amount of meat go a long way. They were usually shaped like a flattened oval, coated in breadcrumbs and fried in oil until they were golden brown and crispy on the outside. They were almost always served with a side of mashed potatoes or maybe some buckwheat. They were the definition of a simple, hearty, and filling main course. While some people might look down on them for being full of bread, Soviet people mastered the art of making them taste great. These patties were a staple, but sometimes you wanted your meat in a rich sauce. The next dish is a Soviet version of a world-famous stew, and they changed it to make it their own. 4. Goulash with rice. If you have ever heard of Hungarian goulash, you might picture a thick paprika-spiced soup. Well, the Soviets took that idea and turned it into their own unique cafeteria classic. Soviet goulash was not really a soup at all. It was a hearty stew made with small chunks of beef that were slow cooked until they were tender. The sauce was the most important part. It was a thick brown gravy, usually made with a base of tomato paste, flour, and some onions. It was not as spicy as the Hungarian original. Instead, it was savory and slightly tangy. What many overlooked is how this dish was served. Instead of being eaten on its own, it was almost always ladled over a pile of a simple starch. The most common pairing was boiled rice or buckwheat kasha. This made the meal even more filling and helped soak up every last drop of that delicious gravy. This was a top-tier cafeteria meal. If goulash was on the menu, it was a good day. It felt more special than a simple kotleta and was a perfect, warming meal for a cold day. It was a taste of something foreign, but made completely Soviet. So far, all our dishes have been hot. But what did people eat when the summer heat hit? The next dish is a bizarre-sounding cold soup that will make you question everything you thought you knew about soup. 5. Okroshka. Get ready for something truly different. Imagine it as a hot, sticky summer day in the 1970s. The last thing you want is a steaming bowl of borscht. The answer was okroshka, a cold soup that is one of the most unique dishes you can imagine. The base of this soup was not broth. It was usually made with kvass, a very popular fermented drink that tastes a little like a sour, fizzy rye bread soda. Into this bubbly, tangy liquid, they would add a whole bunch of finely chopped ingredients. We are talking about boiled potatoes, crunchy radishes, fresh cucumbers, hard-boiled eggs, and some kind of boiled meat, like beef or a type of bologna. To top it all off, a huge amount of fresh dill and green onions were mixed in, along with a big spoonful of sour cream. It sounds really strange, right? But the thing nobody tells you is how incredibly refreshing it is. It is a mix of crunchy, soft, savory, and tangy all in one bowl. It was the perfect way to cool down and get a light, healthy lunch all at once. It was a summer classic that people looked forward to all year. From a strange cold soup, we moved to a spread with a fancy name, but very humble beginnings. This next dish proves that you do not need expensive ingredients to make something delicious. 6. Eggplant caviar. Ikra. The name eggplant caviar sounds incredibly fancy, does it not? You might picture something served to royalty. But in the Soviet Union, this dish, known as ikra, had nothing to do with fish eggs. It was a thick, vegetable spread made from eggplant. To put it mildly, it was a poor man's caviar. It was incredibly popular because eggplants were easy to grow in the southern parts of the country and were very cheap during the late summer and fall. To make it, the eggplants were baked or roasted until they were super soft. Then the flesh was mashed up and mixed with other vegetables like onions, carrots, and tomatoes. The whole mixture was slowly cooked with sunflower oil and seasonings until it became a rich, savory, and slightly sweet spread. People would eat it slathered on a thick slice of black bread. What many overlooked is that this was a brilliant way to preserve the summer harvest. Families would make huge batches of eggplant caviar and seal it in glass jars to eat throughout the long, cold winter. It was a delicious reminder of sunny days and a staple in many households. That was a caviar made from vegetables. Our next dish also has a fancy-sounding ingredient from the sea, but it has a massive secret that made it affordable for everyone. 7. Crab stick salad. Here is a dish that screams late Soviet era. Crab stick salad was a huge deal and was considered pretty fancy and modern in the 1970s. It was a colorful salad made with chopped up crab sticks, sweet canned corn, fluffy boiled rice, and hard-boiled eggs, all mixed together with a generous amount of mayonnaise. Sometimes they would add chopped cucumbers for a bit of crunch. It was a festive dish, often served at celebrations and holiday parties. But here is the massive secret that everyone knew. The crab sticks were not crab at all, not even a little bit. They were an invention called surimi, which is basically a paste made from cheap white fish that was processed, flavored, and colored to look like the leg meat of a king crab. Real crab was impossibly expensive and rare for the average person. But these imitation crab sticks became available and people went wild for them. This salad was a way to feel a little bit fancy and modern. It was a taste of the exotic, even if it was not the real thing. The combination of sweet corn, savory crab, and creamy mayo was a huge hit. From a fake seafood salad, we moved to a real vegetable that was the star of the show. The next dish is a classic comfort food that was a clever way to make a little bit of meat feed a whole family. 8. Stuffed peppers. Stuffed peppers were a beloved homemade lunch, especially in the late summer when bell peppers were plentiful and cheap. This dish, called farci ravani Perez, looked beautiful on the plate and tasted even better. The recipe was simple but smart. You take whole bell peppers, usually green or red, hollow them out, and then stuff them with a delicious filling. The filling was typically a mix of ground meat, often beef or pork, and boiled rice. The rice was the key as it acted as a filler to make the meat go further, just like the bread in cotletti. Onions and some simple seasonings were mixed in as well. Once the peppers were stuffed, they were placed in a pot and slowly simmered in a simple tomato sauce until the peppers were tender and the filling was cooked through. They were often served with a big spoonful of sour cream on top. This was a perfect one-pot meal. You had your vegetables, your meat, and your grains all in one package. It was a bit more work to make than a simple soup, so it felt like a special treat. It was a colorful and hearty lunch that was a favorite for many families. That was a dish where the vegetable was the container. Our next dish is a layered salad that was built like a cake and had a name inspired by a delicate spring flower. 9. Mimosa salad. Like the crab stick salad, mimosa salad was another dish that felt a bit special. It often showed up at holiday tables, but it was simple enough to be a weekend lunch, too. It got its beautiful name because the top layer was made of crumbled, bright yellow egg yolks, which looked like the fluffy yellow mimosa flowers that bloom in the spring. But this salad was not delicate. It was a hearty, layered creation held together with, you guessed it, mayonnaise. The thing nobody tells you is how it was built. It was made in a clear glass bowl so you could see all the pretty layers. The bottom layer was usually canned fish, something like mackerel or sardines, which were mashed up with a fork. On top of that went a layer of grated boiled potatoes, then a layer of grated carrots, then a layer of finely chopped onions. A thin layer of mayo went between each vegetable layer. The final layer was grated hard-boiled egg whites, and then the whole thing was topped with those fluffy, crumbled egg yolks. It sounds like a strange mix, but the flavors worked together beautifully. It was savory, creamy, and very, very filling. From a pretty layered salad, we moved to a soup that was the exact opposite. It was a jumble of ingredients that looked messy, but tasted absolutely incredible. 10. Solyanka. If there was ever an everything but the kitchen sink soup, it is solyanka. This was not a subtle soup. It was a thick, hearty, and powerful explosion of flavor. The key to solyanka's unique taste was the combination of salty, sour, and savory. The base was a rich broth, but it was the mix-ins that made it famous. It was loaded with all kinds of preserved meats. Think different types of sausage, ham, and bacon, all chopped up and thrown in. But the real secret was the sour ingredients. A huge amount of pickles and even the pickle brine were added to the pot. On top of that, you had salty olives and tangy capers. To balance all that sour and salt, a tomato base was often used. The result was a complex, intense soup that was unlike anything else. It was often served with a slice of lemon and a dollop of sour cream. What many overlooked is that this was the perfect soup for using up leftovers. You could throw in any little bits of meat you had in the fridge. It was a popular soup in restaurants and was considered a real treat. That soup was a jumble of ingredients in a pot. The next dish is also a mix of ingredients, but this time they are stuffed inside a pocket of fried dough, perfect for eating on the go. 11. Belyashi. Now we move from the soup bowl to the street corner. Belyashi were a super popular type of street food. Think of them as a savory fried donut stuffed with meat. They were round, golden brown pockets of dough with a small hole in the center. Inside was a simple filling of raw minced meat, usually beef, mixed with a lot of onions and spices. The magic happened during the frying. As the belyash cooked in hot oil, the meat inside would cook in its own juices, and the onions would become sweet. The little hole in the top would let the steam escape and would sometimes bubble with meaty juice. They were greasy, hot, and incredibly delicious. You could buy them from street vendors or at train stations. To put it mildly, they were not the healthiest lunch, but they were cheap, filling, and perfect for a quick bite. There was always a little bit of mystery about the quality of the meat inside a street-bought belyash, but that was part of the adventure. Homemade ones were even better because you knew exactly what was in them. They were a taste of comfort and a satisfying handheld meal. From a fried meat pie with tatar roots, we travel back to a classic Russian soup with a very sour and surprising main ingredient. 12. Rasolnik. If you thought putting pickles in solyanka soup was strange, get ready for rasolnik. This is a soup where pickles are not just an ingredient, they are the absolute star of the show. Rasolnik is a traditional Russian soup that has been around for centuries. Its main flavor comes from salty, sour dill pickles and a splash of their brine. The thing that gives this soup its body came into pearl barley, a chewy and hearty grain that thickens the soup and makes it really filling. The soup also had the usual base of potatoes, carrots, and onions. What many overlooked is that the traditional old-school version of this soup was often made with beef kidneys. This gave it a very deep and earthy flavor. However, by the 1970s, it was more common to find it made with regular beef or even no meat at all. It was a savory, tangy soup that was considered very healthy and restorative. The sourness from the pickles was said to be a great cure after a night of big celebrations. It was a staple in cafeterias and at home, a true classic taste of Russia. That soup was a sour classic. The next dish was seen as the height of sophistication, a fancy restaurant meal that held a delicious, buttery surprise inside. 13. Chicken Kiev. If you wanted to impress someone or celebrate a special occasion in the 1970s, you might have gone to a restaurant and ordered chicken Kiev. This was not your everyday cafeteria lunch. This was fine dining, Soviet style. The dish itself is a work of art. It is a boneless chicken breast that has been pounded flat, then wrapped around a core of cold, herbed garlic butter. The whole chicken parcel is then coated in breadcrumbs and fried until it is perfectly golden and crispy. The real magic happens when you cut into it. The hot, melted garlic butter inside comes rushing out, creating a delicious sauce for the tender chicken. But here's the thing nobody tells you. Its origins are a huge mystery. Though it is named after the capital of Ukraine, some food historians believe it was actually invented in Moscow, while others say French chefs created it for Russian nobility long ago. Whatever its story, by the 1970s, it was a symbol of elegance. It was tricky to make at home. So getting it at a restaurant felt like a true luxury. From the fanciest chicken dish imaginable, we go to one of the most humble and beloved baked goods. This next food could be found in every bakery and in every grandma's kitchen. 14. Piroshki. You cannot talk about Soviet food without talking about piroshki. These are small, baked or fried pies that can have a whole variety of fillings. They are one of the most beloved and versatile foods imaginable. Piroshki are made from a soft, slightly sweet yeast dough. They can be shaped like little boats or ovals. The best part was the surprise inside. The fillings could be savory or sweet. For a lunch, the savory ones were king. The most common fillings were potatoes mashed with fried onions, stewed cabbage, or ground meat. You could also find them filled with mushrooms or hard-boiled eggs with green onions. They were the perfect portable lunch. You could grab one or two from a bakery or a street kiosk and eat them on the go. Every grandmother had her own special recipe, and homemade piroshki were always the best. They would come out of the oven warm, soft, and smelling incredible. They were a cheap and delicious way to fill your stomach. A couple of these pies and a glass of tea or kefir was a classic, simple lunch for millions. Those little pies were a perfect snack. But what if you wanted something bigger, crispier, and juicier? The next dish is a massive fried turnover that was another street food legend. 15. Cheburek. If a belyush is a fried round meat donut, a cheburek is its bigger, flatter, and crispier cousin. This dish comes from the Crimean Tatar people but became wildly popular all across the Soviet Union. A cheburek is a huge half-moon-shaped pastry. It is made from a simple, unleavened dough that is rolled out very thin. It is filled with a thin layer of spiced minced meat, usually lamb or beef, and lots of onions. The edges are crimped shut, and then the whole thing is deep-fried in a lot of very hot oil. The result is a masterpiece of textures. The outside is incredibly crispy and bubbly, while the inside is filled with super juicy, flavorful meat and steaming hot broth that gets created as the meat cooks. You had to be careful with the first bite, or the hot juice would run down your chin. To put it mildly, eating one was a messy but amazing experience. They were classic street food, sold hot out of giant pans of oil. They were big, cheap, and so satisfying. It was fast food, Soviet style. From a fried street food, we moved back to the dinner table for a comforting dish that involved wrapping meat and rice in a tender vegetable leaf. 16. Golubtsi, or cabbage rolls, were a classic comfort food that took a bit of time and love to prepare. Because they were more labor-intensive, they were not something you would see in a cafeteria every day. They were more of a special home-cooked meal, especially for a Sunday lunch. To make them, you had to carefully boil a whole head of cabbage so you could peel off the leaves one by one without tearing them. These soft cabbage leaves then became the wrappers for a delicious filling. Just like with stuffed peppers, the filling was a mix of ground meat, rice, and finely chopped, sautéed onions and carrots. Each cabbage leaf was carefully filled and rolled up into a neat little package. These little cabbage parcels were then packed into a pot and simmered in a creamy tomato sauce, sometimes with sour cream mixed in. They cooked until the cabbage was melt-in-your-mouth tender and the flavors had all blended together. They were a hearty, savory, and incredibly comforting meal that felt like a hug from the inside. That was a complete meal wrapped in a leaf. Our next dish is the most basic, fundamental lunch combination you can imagine, the true definition of a Soviet canteen plate. 17. Cutlets with mashed potatoes. We have already talked about kotlety, but sometimes the menu just said cutlets with mashed potatoes. This was the quintessential Soviet lunch. It was the standard by which all other cafeteria meals were measured. A cutlet here is just another word for the kotleta, that breaded and fried patty of minced meat and bread filler. It was the centerpiece of the plate. But the partner in crime was just as important, the mashed potatoes. Soviet mashed potatoes were usually simple. They were not always made with tons of butter and cream like in the West. Often, they were just boiled potatoes mashed with a bit of the water they were cooked in, maybe a little milk, and salt. The result was a fluffy but sturdy base for the meal. The cutlet would be placed right next to or on top of the pile of potatoes. Sometimes a spoonful of simple brown gravy would be poured over everything. And almost always there would be a pickled cucumber or a small scoop of beet salad on the side for a bit of tangy crunch. It was simple, predictable, and filling. It was the fuel that kept the country running. From the most common dish on land, we head out to sea for a meal named after the Navy, a pasta dish that was simple, cheap, and a favorite of sailors and students alike. 18. Bigos. Let's take a little trip to the western side of the Soviet Union for a dish called bigos. You might know it better as hunter's stew. This dish has Polish roots but was very popular in places like Belarus and Ukraine. Bigos is a rich, hearty, and very savory stew made from cabbage. But here's the kicker: it often used both fresh shredded cabbage and sour, tangy sauerkraut. This combination gave it a really complex flavor. Into this cabbage base, a whole variety of meats would be added. Traditionally, it was a way to use up different cuts of pork and wild game. But in the 1970s, it was more likely to be made with sausage, bacon, and whatever bits of pork were available. Onions, mushrooms, and sometimes dried plums were added to give it a smoky, slightly sweet flavor. It was all slow cooked for hours or even days until all the flavors melded together and the cabbage was incredibly tender. The thing nobody tells you is that people believed bigos tasted even better the next day after it was reheated. It was a perfect winter meal, a true rib-sticking stew that would warm you up completely. From a complex stew, we go to one of the simplest pasta dishes ever invented. This meal was named for the Navy and was beloved for being fast, easy, and super filling. 19. Makaroni po-flotsky. The name makaroni po-flotsky literally means Navy-style pasta, and it is a dish that is exactly as simple and practical as its name suggests. This was the ultimate quick and easy lunch, especially for busy moms or for students on a budget. The recipe could not be simpler. First, you boil some pasta. In the Soviet Union, this was often just basic macaroni tubes. While the pasta is cooking, you fry up some ground meat, usually beef, with finely chopped onions until it is all browned and cooked through. Then you drain the pasta and simply mix it all together with the cooked meat and onions. That is it. There was no fancy tomato sauce or cheese. The flavor came from the savory meat, the sweet onions, and maybe a little salt and pepper. What many overlooked is that this dish was incredibly practical. All the ingredients were cheap and easy to store. You could make a huge pot of it very quickly, and it was guaranteed to fill you up. It was the kind of no-frills, high-energy food perfect for hungry sailors, and it became a beloved classic all across the country for that same reason. We have had street food, soups, and cafeteria classics. For our final dish, we are heading outdoors for a meal that is all about fire, friends, and summer celebrations. 20. Shashlik. Finally, we have a dish that was more than just a lunch. It was an event. Shashlik is the Soviet version of shish kebab, and it was the ultimate summertime food. This dish has its roots in the Caucasus region, in places like Georgia and Armenia, but it was loved everywhere. Shashlik consists of cubes of meat grilled on long metal skewers, called shampuri, over an open fire. The most traditional meat was lamb, but pork was also extremely popular, and sometimes beef or chicken was used. The secret to amazing shashlik was the marinade. The meat would be soaked for hours or even overnight in a tangy mixture. This could be vinegar, lemon juice, or even kefir, mixed with lots of sliced onions, pepper, and bay leaves. The acid in the marinade made the meat incredibly tender and flavorful. Cooking shashlik was a social activity. People would gather with friends or family at their dacha, their country cottage, or just in a park. They would make a fire, grill the meat, and spend the day relaxing and enjoying the outdoors. It was a taste of freedom and celebration, the perfect meal to end our journey through the Soviet lunch plate. Soviet lunch plate. Soviet lunch plate. Soviet lunch plate.